Hi everyone, good morning and thanks for joining us today. So my name is Caris and I'm the Digital Marketing Executive here at Moorepay. So in today's webinar, we're going to be discussing the coronavirus's impact on returning to the workplace, particularly in light with the recent changes to the government's advice and local lockdowns being reintroduced. So before we begin, there are a couple of housekeeping things that I'd like to just quickly cover. Firstly, we've got a lot of people registered for today's webinar, so we've muted everyone's microphones. So just to confirm, no one can hear you. So feel free to eat like a bag of crisps really loudly if you want to. If you're having difficulties with the webinar, just let us know using the chat box in the GoToWebinar panel that you'll see on your screen. So in this box, you'll also be able to see the questions box. Here you can, feel free to add questions and we'll try and cover as many questions as we can in the Q&A at the end of the session. After the webinar, we'll send you a link to the recording on YouTube and we'll share you a copy of the slides as well. So you don't need to take notes, and if you want to or have to leave the webinar early, then that's fine. We'll send you everything that you need at the end. In terms of the structure of the webinar today, we'll be covering the latest advice from the government and what that means, including health and safety considerations for returning to the workplace and what support you can receive for managing all of this. After the main session, we'll come to the Q&A from our health and safety experts. For anyone who isn't a customer of ours, Moorepay have been providing payroll and HR software and managed services for more than 50 years now, and we serve over 10,000 customers from a range of industries. But I'm not going to go into that in this webinar. If you would like any more information, just feel free to drop us a note in the questions box and I can pick that up with you after the webinar. So moving on, I'd like to introduce your presenters today. Oh, that's how you can ask questions, by the way, using the question box. So our first speaker today is Phil Barker. He's been with Moorepay since 2008, starting as a health and safety consultant, and now he's our health and safety team manager. He has all sorts of qualifications in environmental health policy, and he is an absolute font of knowledge for everything health and safety and COVID related. So you are in great hands with him at the start of this webinar. After Phil's talk, we'll also hear from Audrey Robertson, who is our HR consultancy and claims manager. Her career in HR, employment law and related insurances spans over 15 years, and she'll be running through some of our HR services that can support businesses returning to the workplace. So I'll now hand over to Phil, who's going to run through some practical help for this pandemic.
Thank you, Caris. A lot to live up to on that introduction. Yes. If you want to move on to the next slide for us, then we can start. So the background to us deciding to put this webinar on was about 3 weeks ago. The government were announcing that they were going to start doing a press campaign to get employees and encourage employees back into the workplace. Most of what we're talking around is based on what the Westminster government are saying, so it applies in the main to England. There are slight differences in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, but in general, where we're going, the paths that we're following are very, very similar. There's just some slight differences on timelines and things like that. But so just for the ease of talking about one message today, we're going to focus on what is the English Westminster rules and things like that. But obviously, if you've got any specific questions around businesses that are working in Wales, Northern Ireland or Scotland, then just pop them in the questions and we'll cover it at the end. So yeah, so in England there was a push, and at the beginning of August, the message sort of changed from if you can work from home, you should work from home, to more of a going to the office because your employer's made the workplace safe. Working from home is just one way of working safely. The office can be just as safe. So the message changed slightly from encouraging people to work from home to starting to encourage people to work in the office. And as I said earlier, there was a press campaign planned to start 2 weeks ago, and we were going to sort of like feed on the back of that press campaign and give you some advice. Now, obviously, what we've seen in the news is that the cases have increased, and now there's an even finer line to balance really between getting people back to work in the normal office location, workplace, and stopping the infections from increasing. So hopefully we can talk you through how to walk that fine line, and to help you maximize your own requirements for your own employees, your own location, your own businesses. I mean, even last night, it was announced that Newcastle, Sunderland, Durham, that area are going to go into lockdown midnight tonight, and then you've got other lockdowns. So it's changing, the picture's changing daily, and depending on whereabouts in the country you live. So first slide is obviously the government messaging has changed from protect the NHS and everything to this hands, face and space. So why is that important? So if you look at the picture on the left of the screen, that's a picture taken from the government advisor's SAGE, one of their documents, and it explains why and how the virus is transmitted. And we've covered this on previous webinars, but it doesn't hurt to go over it again. Basically, the infected person can walk into a room, and as they're talking, and the louder they talk, the bigger the problem here is. But as they're talking, droplets of moisture come out of their upper respiratory system just naturally, and if that's got the virus, that spreads around the workplace. So the other person in the room can either breathe that in directly, or that moisture, that contaminated droplet, can rest on a surface, and then that person can touch the surface, contaminate their hands. So this is why it's important that we keep our hands clean, so that if we have touched a contaminated surface, we're getting rid of any of the virus that might be on our hands before we touch our own face. The face message is more about the person walking into the room, so that when they're talking, when they're coughing, they're not spreading those potentially contaminated droplets around the airspace or onto surfaces. And the 2 meter social distancing is still important, which is where the space comes in, because the science basically says that in normal conversation, normal coughing, the droplets don't travel 2 meters. So you're not going to go into somebody else's breathing zone if you're in that kind of 2 meter space. Now, we're seeing a lot of confusion with businesses around the 1 meter plus. 1 meter plus is not 1 meter and 1 centimeter. 1 meter plus is 1 meter plus a mask, 1 meter plus a face screen, 1 meter plus a screen between desks. So we still need to be working to 2 meters wherever possible. The bottom of that slide is obviously just a reminder that the management regulations in health and safety require risk assessments to be completed and risk assessments to be reviewed every time guidelines change. I think, as I mentioned to somebody the other day, the guidelines at the moment are changing daily. So coronavirus, COVID risk assessments should be under continual review, not just a piece of paper that we've completed, put in a system of work and put to one side. Every time the government changes the guidelines, we should be pulling that out, looking at it. Are we still complying with the guidelines? Are we still achieving what we need to achieve? Do we need to change what we're doing? So there's quite a lot going on at the moment, and it's keeping health and safety professionals around the country busy, well, around the world busy, to be fair. Do you want to move on to the next slide for us, please, Caris? Right, so as we said, that there is a push from the government and the World Health, get my teeth in, and the World Health Organization, encouraging people to return to work. The thoughts behind this are that employers have had time to look at how they can operate their business safely. So we've got things in place like additional cleaning regimes. We've got social distancing in place. We've implemented one-way systems. So there's a push to get people back into the workplace because the workplace is reasonably safe. Obviously, as well, getting people back into city centres helps with the economy because they start going to sandwich shops, buying newspapers from newsagents, etc., etc. But the main thing is, it's believed now that workplaces can be made safe. Now, obviously, your employees are looking at that message that's going out saying, come back into the workplace, it's safe to do so. But that's also getting the message of, we've got increased cases. Obviously, we've not yet seen an increase in hospital admissions, which is good, but is that going to follow in 10 days? Are we going to see that these increased number in cases result in an increased number of hospitalizations? All of these thoughts are going through employees' heads. So how do we balance as employers the government desire and the World Health Organization desire to get people back in the workplace, potentially employers' desire to get people back in the workplace because it can improve productivity or have perceived benefits, and this concern that our staff have? Well, the key thing really is to talk to your staff, explain what you've done, explain why it's safe to come into the workplace, explain why what you've done follows government guidelines, and really involve them. Ask them for any suggestions, saying we've done A, B, and C, but can you suggest anything else we might want to do? And the poster on the right is basically the government the government posters they've provided for employers to say they've signed off and they're committed to having a secure workplace. So there's a lot really about this. Is about talking to people, it's about talking to employees. What would they want in place to make them feel safe to come into work? So without labouring the point, because I could talk about this for all day, and we are doing regularly to customers. If you just want to move on to the next slide for us, Caris, and we'll move on. So on the back of coming back into the workplace, one of the other decisions that we need to think about is home working. It's probably, well, for those of us that work for Moorepay, it's exactly 6 months since we left our offices and started home working. For everybody else, it's probably a week to go before it's 6 months. The government, I think it was the 22nd of March, that was the day that they said, if you can work from home, you should work from home. So we're into 6 months of home working. Is that really temporary anymore? Plus, we've also into a situation now where the government's encouraging people back into the office, and where businesses are now making decisions about whether home working continues or whether people come back into the office. So are your home workers working at home temporarily anymore, or are they transitioning into being permanent home workers? If we think that we're transitioning into being permanent home workers, we need to be looking at how they're working at home. Is it safe to do so? Are they working on a kitchen table, trying to balance arguments with cats, kids, and cooking? Do they have access to the right chairs? Are they sitting on sofas, working on coffee tables? Do we have the right office equipment there for these home workers to transition into a more permanent home working way of working? So there's lots of questions to ask there. And I've just put this up on the slide now because we're getting lots of questions coming in on both the employment law and the health and safety advice lines from clients at the moment around people have come into contact with people. We've been told somebody's had contact. We've been told somebody's got symptoms. And whilst it was a lot clearer probably in March and April when it all happened that, you know, who stayed at home, who didn't stay at home, and everybody was working from home, the questions now are a little bit more subtle around when people should be self-isolating or when people should be working from home. And there's a whole load of guidance on the NHS website around when to self-isolate. So basically, just as a reminder, your employees should be self-isolating if they or somebody they live with has symptoms or has tested positive. If they've been at work in the previous 48 hours to having the symptoms or the positive test, then they need to be talking to you as the employer to try and work out direct contacts so that direct contacts can be informed. So a direct contact is somebody where you've had significant contact with, where you've potentially been less than 1 meter for more than a minute, shaking hands, skin to skin contact, working face to face, been sat in a small vehicle. There's quite a few scenarios where you could be in direct contact. You then inform the people who that employee has been in direct contact with if they've got the symptoms, and then the direct contacts, they don't necessarily at the moment need to self-isolate. NHS Test and Trace will speak to anybody who's tested positive, identify who they believe are direct contacts, and they will contact those direct contacts. And I'm trying to make this as simple, but it's difficult to explain in simple terms. So the NHS will tell people whether they need to self-isolate. All your employees need to do once they've been in direct contact with somebody who's suspected of having it is just really social distance, really take care to be more than 2 meters away from everybody, really take care to wear masks where they need to, and really make sure they're washing their hands, because at the moment it's only a theoretical risk until NHS test and trace get in touch with them, but it's just worth taking those extra precautions over that theoretical risk. And then obviously if the test is positive, then as I said earlier, the test and trace services from the NHS will be in touch with the relevant people and inform them to self-isolate. And I know Audrey's going to touch on what the employment law issues are following somebody being told to self-isolate, because obviously there's various things around what do we do to pay people, can people carry on working from home, and this kind of thing. So I think that's me done now. Carrot, if you want to move on to the next slide. Oh, no, one quick one. The recent restrictions that have come out, they are mainly around socialising. So it is mainly around you can't have more than 6 people meeting internally or externally. So they don't really have any direct impact on the majority of businesses. So engineering works, offices, etc. Because you've got controls in place, the limits of 6 don't have any direct involvement. However, if you're running cafes, restaurants, pubs, anywhere else that's hospitality type or where people gather, you must make sure that we're not encouraging or we're not allowing groups of more than 6 people to gather. We should be having table service. It's almost a mandatory requirement within the guidance now that table service is in place for these businesses. The guidance says where possible. Now, in health and safety, we're used to working with the term reasonably practicable, which allows for a cost-benefit analysis. Where possible is actually a higher level of requirement, so it is where achievable. So the only, in my mind and my interpretation, the only way of saying that it's not possible to do table service is where you've got no Wi-Fi or no internet mobile signal, because apps are readily available to facilitate table service. They're not expensive, so it would be very difficult to prove or argue that table service wasn't possible unless you physically don't have access to the internet. Test and trace has always been advisable, strongly recommended. Now, from this week, it's a legal requirement, so you must keep records of people that come into your business if you're in these sectors. There are fines for non-compliance, mainly around the test and trace, but if you do allow groups of more than 6 to gather, then the police and the local authority have the power to shut the business down. And part of the announcement, which hasn't really been picked up on by the media, is that the government are increasing the potential for enforcement activity by recruiting, bringing back retired environmental health officers, fast-tracking graduates through the process to become environmental health officers, and also introduce this new post of COVID secure marshals. Now, whilst the COVID secure marshals have no actual power to issue fines, to force people to break up, they're there as an advisory capacity. They do have obviously the ability to phone the police or the local authority where people are not following their advice. So there is an increased risk of enforcement activity where people are not following these guidelines. And I think now it's definitely time to move over to Audrey.
Good morning, everybody. For anyone who attended our really regular webinars on these subjects in previous months, welcome back. I don't think any of us imagined at the beginning we'd still be doing these 6 months down, but here we are. I wanted to start by including a quick reminder about the government job retention scheme. So I do know this is something that many of you are particularly interested in these webinars, and obviously it feeds into your thinking as you're planning for bringing people back and so on. So currently the position is that the scheme ends for everyone on the 31st of October. And that's what you need to plan to do, because at that point your employees need to be paid as normal and should have their normal shifts and so on. It is true to say that commentators in various quarters, including the Federation of Small Business, have been talking about what's being called a tsunami of job losses from what are otherwise perfectly viable businesses. In Parliament, the Treasury Select Committee is pushing the government for some kind of extension. Yesterday, Andy Burnham, who's the Mayor of Greater Manchester, said that he thought an extension, at least in certain industries such as events, was probably inevitable. So it does seem possible that some kind of targeted scheme could be introduced, but for now we have to assume that the 31st of October is the cliff edge. So if you do think that you might need to restructure and there could be possible job losses after 31st of October, remember that you will need to build in time to consult with your employees, make your plans now. If you think you may lose more than 20 jobs, there are collective consultation rules to follow. So make sure you do get some good advice over that and lay your plans carefully. Some of you might have seen in the news last weekend, the Union Unite successfully challenged Arcadia, the retail giant headed by Sir Philip Green. They had basically made around 400 redundancies from their head office and had initially paid notice pay based on furlough money. So effectively, they calculated the notice pay on 80% of people's substantive pay and were forced to back off from that. You can use furlough money as a contribution towards notice pay. That's perfectly legal, but you do need to make sure that people receive their full contractual notice pay one way or the other if you do have to make redundancies. And I'll touch on this a bit more later, but if there's any local lockdown, such as the one in the northeast that Phil just mentioned, anything between now and the end of October, if you've got any staff who've been furloughed previously, you remember you can still furlough them again. So if that helps you to manage if your business is forced into some kind of curfew or closure, that may help. Okay, Caris, if we could move on. Obviously, Phil's gone into this in quite a lot of detail, and it's difficult to give general guidance because every single person here will be in very different circumstances. It might be that making your premises COVID safe just means reduced accommodation, relying on a degree of home working to continue, or you might be in a completely opposite situation where you need to bring everyone back and you're thinking about how you can do that. One example of that is businesses where there's some element of data security that's been a challenge for the last few months. As Phil mentioned in passing, there's been some talk that after this length of time, that working from home has almost become established as a right. In employment law terms, we talk about whether it's been the term has been implied into contracts of employment, meaning that it would be very difficult for employers to insist that their employees return when they've been working at home for so long. Obviously, the last thing you want is to get into some kind of legal dispute with any employee, but it's important to remember that it's quite difficult for an employee to establish in law that a term has been implied into the contract. There's quite a few hoops to jump through there. But I think it's important to make clear that obviously you may have sent employees to work at home because of a government instruction. Now that instruction is lifted, the emphasis has kind of subtly shifted onto employers who are now the ones taking it on themselves, as it were, to only have a few people in or delaying the opening of their offices. So in some of these cases, some employees might be able to argue that it's now the employer who's changed contracted working place. Quite a lot of employers who previously didn't allow much home working are probably likely to find that quite a few of their arguments against it may have evaporated if they've been working quite successfully over the last 6 months. Many businesses did start home working quite suddenly, we all kind of just went home. And Phil explained this in more detail, that if you are considering longer term arrangements, you'll need to think about the accommodation, your duty of care, and aside from those health and safety concerns, you need to consider your IT security, data security policies, such as what the protocols are for caring for equipment and laptops. What are your rules around printing? How do people dispose of paper-based information securely? You'll need to look at performance metrics, processes for that, set up permanent communication channels, consider employees' well-being. So there's a whole raft of things you need to think about on top of the health and safety aspects. It may be a good idea to actually have some conversations with people who request permanent home working as a flexible working request, particularly if they're asking for other changes. And that provides a proper framework leading to a permanent contract change if it's agreed. And that means further changes can't be requested by an employee within 12 months. So that gives some way of looking ahead securely. So extending home working or closing your workplace or reducing the size of it could actually be a way that you possibly might consider avoiding some redundancies. So do have a think about that as well. Caris, could we have the next slide, please? Phil mentioned I was going into this in more detail. We haven't got much time to go into it in a lot of detail, but I will just show you this slide. So it's obviously quite challenging trying to remember all the different permutations. So basically, in March, the government introduced statutory sick pay payable from day 1 rather than from day 4. And that situation still applies to anyone who has a positive test for COVID, anyone self-isolating with a household member or member of their bubble or extended household with COVID, anyone who's advised by the NHS or public health, and also if they've got a planned hospital admission, they will be needing to self-isolate for 2 weeks. Currently, we don't have a shielding program, but if that came back, also SSP is payable. So all of those, that's SSP. If someone returns from abroad from a country and then they have to quarantine, they don't have any automatic right to SSP. You probably need to think about that in terms of the exact circumstances, particularly if they were abroad on business. And there's nothing to actually stop you paying SSP, even if there's no entitlement to it. You could make that payment, and that could be a choice to make. After all, it is very important. You don't want people to be coming into work breaking the law about quarantining and potentially spreading an infection in your workplace. That could be a solution there. Lots of people are now talking about children being sent home from school. They tend to be in bubbles in school of a class or a year group. Something like 3% of schools have already sent classes or even entire years home. If you have employees in that position, then they're entitled to unpaid time off to care for dependents. That's just a general entitlement that they have, and that's intended to be for a couple of days while you make more or better arrangements for childcare. You will need to discuss with your employees how to manage that if they're going to be off for a couple of weeks, and they may need to perhaps use some annual leave as well. If you do send someone home from work, that's effectively medically suspending them. So in that case, you would have to be paying them in full. And that's something to think about, particularly if you're looking at having, for example, temperature checks in the workplace. I think probably we could talk about that for ages, but Caris, will just sort of move on if that's okay with you. So just to quickly run through this, we do have a couple of products that might be quite useful and flesh out some of the things we've talked about today. So our Back to Work consultancy is about getting your workplace safe, and it involves 2 consultants from Moorepay working with you, one from HR and one from Phil's team in health and safety in any combination that you need them, a high-level discussion, and then some really technical help and visits that might help you to move forward. So do have a look at that. We also have a piece of consultancy around home working, as well as being able to send you an agreement for home working with your employees. What we can do is provide a whole pack of information that contains information about some of the things I've been talking about around IT, data security, well-being, and your obligations, and actually how to talk to your employees, what kind of policy you might like to issue. So if you're interested in either of those, do drop us a line through the conversation box and we'll get back to you. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you very much, Phil and Audrey. That was really useful. And I think it answered quite a lot of people's questions coming onto this webinar. So we've got a few questions to cover from the audience. If there's any that I haven't covered, then don't worry, we will get in touch with you by email. So don't worry, we'll answer your questions. The first one, I think Audrey covered in her slides, but maybe you can chip in, Audrey. So for employees who are at work, does the employer have to give full pay if they're absent due to being advised to self-isolate while they're awaiting their results for them or a member of their household?
No, they are they're entitled to statutory sick pay. It would depend what's in your contract about any additional sickness benefit that you provide, whether you provide full pay during periods of sickness. You'd need to have a look at your contract, but certainly as a minimum, they'd be entitled to statutory sick pay.
Cool, thanks, Audrey. So another question is, will meeting with more than 6 people be possible if everyone's using a face mask? So from my knowledge, I believe that's fine within an office or business environment, but not in a social. Is that correct, Phil?
Yeah, although the office guidance does say that where possible, you should carry on using video technology for meetings and avoid face-to-face meetings. So the decision process as to why that meeting needs to be face-to-face would have to be robust.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Cool, thank you. So someone else asked, is it all right to have staff back on a rota basis for a month or so, kind of as a test to show that the office is safe, and then move everyone back into the office after a short period of time?
The moving everybody back into the office would depend on whether the risk assessment says that's achievable, and how much office space you've got. Now, the shift pattern is one thing that we do look at and advise clients. It may be that rather than working 8 while 4, 9 while 5, whatever normal office shift patterns are, that you split the shifts up and you start 6 while 12, 12 while 6, or something like that, and you look at the shift patterns. Obviously, there's going to be HR implications around changing people's terms and conditions, hours of work, etc., etc. Now, one thing that is good out of that question is piloting. So it may be that you bring in 20% of your staff, 30% of your staff on a pilot to see how it works, and then you can tweak your arrangements and your procedures around that, and actually use that as a way of confirming how many people you believe you can safely get into the office. Bearing in mind it's 2 meter rules and it's 1 meter plus, it's very unlikely, very unusual that I think that you're going to be able to get everybody back into the office working normal shift patterns. It's just something that we're looked at with quite a few clients, and we're not really working out how they can get everybody in. There will be out there somewhere the exception to what I'm saying, where there's enough office space to spread people around and you can get everybody into the office, but it just needs to be really considered as to whether you get everybody in on normal shift patterns or whether you spread shift patterns around to reduce occupancy levels at any one time to allow for that 2 meter zone, or whether you're going to be looking at putting glass screens around everybody's desk to protect people and go to 1 meter. But a lot to consider and probably too much to talk through on this in the short answer here.
And I think just from an HR perspective, I'd just add that it does depend what the people who are not rotated are doing. Obviously, if they're working at home, it's much easier to do that. If you're talking about effectively sort of taking hours off people, obviously that's a whole other can of worms. So yes, what are the other people doing if they're not rotated in?
Yeah, those are very good points, actually. Yeah, so maybe a bespoke solution needs to be for your business, but some good advice there. So this is quite a good one, maybe for Audrey. So what do we do if someone's very unhappy returning to work, maybe from being working from home or furloughed, but has no reason to, be unhappy other than general anxiety about the virus? What would you recommend?
Well, it's difficult to advise on that without the specifics. Of course, the first thing I'd advise you do is sit down and try and understand a little bit more about what their anxieties are. So it might be, in fact, not about the workplace. It could be about how they get there. They might be anxious about public transport. It might be that you'll be able to reassure them a little bit, invite them in and show them around. Employees do have a right, if they genuinely feel unsafe in a workplace, to walk out, and you don't want to get into that situation. So I think my suggestion would be that you try and reach some kind of accord with them and reassure them, but it would rather depend on the exact circumstances.
And I'd probably just chip in on the back of that one as well. I mean, we as managers, we know that quite often employees don't voice their concerns. So one person's anxiety might be an indication that other people in the team are also anxious. And by addressing and working with that one person, you might actually offset other people's anxieties as well.
Yeah, that's
so really
true.
use it as an opportunity really to understand and get suggestions from that person as to how to make it safe so that they're happy to come into work, and that will probably make it a lot more, the other employees in the team a lot more confident to come in.
Yeah, that's very good advice. Thank you, both of you. Someone else asked, is close contact different to direct contact? And is close contact less than 2 meters apart for longer than 15 minutes?
Well, luckily I've kept that slide open on my notes. Right, so close contact is defined as, just for example here, spend significant time in the same household, face-to-face contact within 1 meter, potentially being coughed on, having skin-to-skin contact, contact within 1 meter for 1 minute or more, and has been within 2 meters of somebody who has tested positive for more than 15 minutes. So on the NHS website, it's got a whole list, but that's just sort of like the headline definitions.
Cool, that's great. Thank you, Phil. We will share these slides with everyone afterwards, so don't worry, we'll have Phil's notes for you there. So the last question, does an employer need proof to apply for SSP for an unemployed?
Sorry, Carrie, I got as far as does an employer need proof? Is that to pay SSP?
It is, yes. So to pay SSP for an unemployed.
Sorry, yes. Well, as most people will be aware, you can self-certify for the first 7 weeks of absence. So no, you don't. Employees should be able to get from the NHS website an effective equivalent to a fit note, and you can ask for that. So you after 7 days, you should be able to get some form of, as it were, evidence from your employee.
Great, thanks very much for clarifying that. So I'm going to wrap up the questions there. There are a few that we haven't answered, so in that case, we will email you afterwards with our advice in response to those. So just to finish up, I'd like to point you towards the Moorepay Knowledge Centre. So if you've enjoyed this webinar, then you'll no doubt get something of value out of here. You'll find loads of things to do with up-to-date employment law and payroll legislation in the resources section, as well as loads of topical blogs by our experts, including Phil and Audrey. So if you look in the blog section, you'll see some recent blogs that cover the coronavirus in detail if you'd like any more information. We also share these on our social media, so do follow us on LinkedIn, Twitter and Facebook if you want any up-to-date knowledge. So I hope you found the webinar today really helpful. Thanks so much for joining us, and thank you again to Phil and Audrey for hosting and answering everyone's questions. We'll close up the webinar now, but we will share it with you afterwards. I hope everyone has a lovely day, and thank you very much for coming.